What's up guys, today we're going to be creating this scrolling dot gradient in the Blender compositor. Before we jump into it, I'm going to go over a bit of theory to hopefully help you guys understand what we're going to be doing here today a little bit better. If you're not interested, skip to this timestamp right here and you can continue right on to the tutorial. If not, stick with me and we'll go over a bit of theory real quick. Okay, so the theory. We have this plane here. What we can do is we can apply a sine wave gradient to both the x and the y directions to create this wave pattern. If we increase the resolution of the sine wave by increasing the multiplier on it, it will become more and more detailed. I think maybe like 10 repetitions is good in either direction. So we have this, but from the top, remember this is what we're going to be seeing on the composite. It just looks like a blank white page. So what we can do is we can introduce a plane and have that plane clip the sine waves and have only the pattern above the plane be white and the rest will have that be black. So then from the top, it looks like a grid of dots. It goes to white dots, almost like a checkerboard pattern, to black dots. And that's where our gradient is going to come from. So now that we have this, we want this to scroll. And the thing about sine waves is you can add a constant to them in order to make them shift left or right, or in this case along the x-axis or the y-axis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a constant going in the x and y-axis in order to make the actual sine wave. Might be easier to see if I move the plane down so the whole thing is white, to make the actual sine waves move. And now, when I put the plane intersecting them and view it from up top, it gives the illusion, remember these aren't actually dots, these are just the peaks that we're showing in white. It gives the illusion of dots scrolling across the plane. One last thing, how are we going to get this to transition from black to white? The thing that we're going to do is we're going to increase the gradient of the plane. So in simple terms, like this means rotating it. As you can see, the lower it goes, the more white you can see. The higher it goes, the more black you can see because of the way it intersects the wave pattern. So now that we have this, we view it from the top, you can see that the contrast between the white and the black is proportional with the steepness of the intersecting plane. And we can do that in the opposite way. We want to do a black to white transition. And then the constant, which we can actually define as the midline, if you set the constant to 0, the gradient will be right down in the middle of the plane, as you can see here. Alright, so that's the theory. Let's move on to the actual composite nodes. Okay, so we're going to get started. First, let's go into the compositing tab, the default one. And I actually don't want the cube here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that. Let's try that again. Perfect, nothing. That's exactly what we wanted. Let's go to, you would think, the compositor, but no, we actually want to go to the texture node editor first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to brush, new texture. I'm going to call this UV map. UV map is going to be very important. Alright, so check mark, use nodes, and we actually don't want to use the color for an output. What we want to do is go to Shift A, input coordinates. We want this going into color, not normal. Let's go up to compositor. We're in the compositor tab right here by default. Use nodes. Render layers, we don't want render layers. What we want is texture. We're going to use the texture we just created down here. Color, UV map. And now if we Control Shift T on texture, that will create a viewer node so we can see what's going on live. Go down to the tab, the texture node tab, and go to image editor. Now we can bring up a live feed of the viewer node, see what's going on. Alright, so this is all white because we have the value plugged into the image. We want the color plugged into the image, what we see here. Now we can see here the live UV map, and we can actually change this and it will change live for us. Okay, so that's the easy part. What we're going to do next is create the dot texture. Remember, if you watched the theory, those are the little dots. Again, if you did enjoy that theory part of the video, I plan on doing more stuff like that. I don't really see that in a lot of videos, and I find it really helpful just to understand it before you actually get into the tutorial. So if you do want to see more content like that, make sure to subscribe so I know that that's a good thing and that people want to keep seeing that. We want to create that dot texture. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to separate RGB. The whole point of the UV map is we want to use the red channel, which is going along the y-axis, and we want to use the green channel, which is going along the x-axis of this texture. We want to separate those so that way we can use the individual x and y gradients to create the x and y sign pattern, the wave pattern. So you can see for red that we have the black to white cross, and then for green we have it up and down. Let's start with the red. So I'm going to math, Shift A to search, by the way. You just do Shift A, search. And we are going to go to sine. This also works with cosines, but cosine in this case would just be an offset of sine. And then, let's do another Shift A, math, multiply. Let's multiply this by, I don't know, maybe 10? Okay, so you would think that there would be 10 repetitions of this, but this isn't actually the case because one full cycle of a sine wave is actually 2 pi. So what we're going to do before this is not multiply by 10. We're going to multiply this by 2 pi. So you can do 2 times pi. But what I actually prefer is just to type in tau, which is by default 2 pi. That's what tau is. It's 2 times the value of pi. So then we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 repetitions. Perfect, just what we wanted. And then let's do this for the green channel. So I'll move this down here. Actually move this note out of the way just so it's easier. Green, let's do the same thing. I just selected all these, hit Shift D to copy them, and I'll plug that in. And awesome, we have the same thing. So how are we going to get that dot pattern? Well, what we did in the theory was we just added them together. If I add these together, it will create a checkerboard pattern like this. And then once we introduce the gradient, we'll see the actual dots. But you might be wondering, well, I added these. There's a white stripe here. Shouldn't it look more like this? If you remember the actual 3D model that I showed, those black parts, those aren't just values of 0, remember. Because we're not clamping these values from 0 to 1, those black values are actually 0 and negative numbers. So if we add the troughs of this to the troughs of that, then we actually end up with negative values, and that's why there's black even though we're adding these together. That's why it's not just white lines crossing each other. Okay, so that's the actual dot pattern. Now let's move on to the gradient. How it intersects the plane is we're going to subtract the value of the dot pattern, or we're going to subtract a gradient from the value of the dot pattern, and that should create the desired pattern we want. Remember, we're intersecting the wave texture, so anything below is going to be black and anything above is going to be white. So let's subtract that, and nice. Those are dots alright. But one thing we want to do is we actually want to rotate this so it's going from the top left corner to the bottom right corner. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to Shift A rotate node, and I'm pretty sure you rotate this -45. Awesome. But if I plug this in, you see it doesn't cover the whole screen, and if you see overlapping, it kind of creates some artifacts on the sides where there's like a harsh line. So what I'm going to do before I rotate it is I'm going to shift a scale node. And what I had was 1.11 and 1.97. And that should just barely cover the whole screen. Let's plug this into the viewer node to see if that covers it. Perfect. Remember, if you want to view something quickly in the viewer node, what you can always do is do Control-Shift, left-click, and that will automatically give you what you want. And then if you want to see the final, full composite, what you have already, Control-Shift, left-click on the node right before the viewer node. And I also want this to be more square. It's going to look like the dots are stretched. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a value node. I'm going to plug that in to however many repetitions we want. And let's make that 32. For ease of viewing, I don't know how YouTube compression is going to help with this. Let's make it 16 to start. It's not square, it's not proportional. So what we want to do is we want to multiply the height by the aspect ratio. So I'm going to get another math node, plug that in to here, and I'm going to multiply it by the aspect ratio, which in my case is 16 by 9. So I'm going to do 16 divided by 9. Oops, that should actually be going into the width node. Make sure that's set to multiply, not add, so that it actually does its job. Cool. So now we have perfectly proportional alignment of dots, and the next step is to make this scroll. So it's going to be really easy. We're going to add in a math node to both, and then I'm pretty sure to get this going in the right direction, it's going to be subtract, but really you can just add negative numbers. But I want this to be subtract for a reason you'll see later. Let's add a value node so we can control these at the same time. You see, as we increase the scroll value, it will give the illusion of scrolling. Okay, that's perfect. We're actually almost done with this. The last thing we need to do is to add the gradient, or more specifically, modify the gradient. So, we have this gradient scaled, rotated. All we need to do now is add one last math node. I'm going to make this a multiply add. We can use this to control strength of the gradient. The higher strength, the more contrast there will be between the light and dark. And the constant will be in control of where the midline is, the transition, or the halfway point between light and dark. I'm going to maybe increase this a lot, maybe to I don't know, 4.4 I had, and negative 3.17. Cool, and now as we increase the scroll, it has the illusion of scrolling. And this is great because the dots will collapse in on themselves. This is an infinitely scrolling background. No matter how much you increase this value by, it will always stay similar to itself, which is good. Because you're not actually moving the gradient, you're moving the repeating wave pattern. What I want is this to actually move from the top left to the bottom right. So this is real easy of a fix. All I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the y-coordinate of the UV texture. Oops. Flip the y-coordinate of the UV texture in the scale, and that should have it scrolling from the top left to the bottom right. Awesome. Let's say we want this to scroll with the frames. Well, I'm going to add another math node to the scroll controller, and I'm going to divide this value by a factor. Doesn't have to be an integer factor, but a factor of how many frames there are if I want this to be a repeating pattern. So by default there are 250 frames, so maybe I am going to divide this by 12.5, and that will give me 20 cycles of this pattern before it loops. And this is going to be the frequency, so it's going to be one cycle every 12.5 frames. And the lower you have this value, the more it's going to repeat. And let's test it out. So if I go from 0 to frame, let's say frame 25, it didn't loop on itself, it's not the same how it was. If we're changing the frames by a multiple of this frequency, it should be the same pattern where we left off by going up a multiple, right? But that's not the case. So what we want to do actually is take this value one more time, and what we're going to do is we're going to multiply this by 2 pi, or tau. And what that will do is basically scale it with the sine function, because the sine function operates on a cycle of every 2 pi or tau. So now if I go from frame 0 to frame 25, let's say, it's going to be the same. But if I'm in the middle, let's say frame 13, it's not going to be the same. So now every 12.5 cycles, it will do one dot will go over to the position of the adjacent dot. 0, 5, 10, see how it's looping, 15, 20, 25. Alright, so that is that. I actually want this to be based on the frames, like I've been saying this whole time. So what you can actually do, I didn't know this was a thing until recently, and it's really cool. You can do hashtag frame or just frame, but it feels cooler to type hashtag frame. And that will actually, if I open up a timeline here, you can actually see it change based on what frame you're on, which I think is really cool. Okay, so that's literally the entire pattern. We have a controller for the frequency. What you can do is you can select a node, hit N. Oh, I already had that open. So let's say this isn't open. If you need to open the menu on the right side, you can hit N while selecting a node. Go over to node, give it a name, and a label. So I'm going to call this frequency. I'm going to label it frequency so you can actually see it in the node editor. It's named frequency, so now I know that this node controls the frequency of how often the dots shift. And I'm going to name this one resolution, name this one frame, aspect ratio. Let's name this one right here gradient and midline. The multiplier controls the gradient and the constant controls the midline. Now we've got this. You can really customize this and use this however you want. You can use it on geometry. In this case, I'm using it as a composite background for a render. So I want to make this look a bit fancy. I want to add some post-processing to it. So first, what we can do is we can add a color ramp to give it color. Let's see, I want to make this a bit more hard lines, so I'm going to make it constant. And then let's make this like, thinking like an orange sunset type color on one hand, and then I had almost like pinkish red. Yeah, almost like that. And then it looks great, but it is looking a little flat. So the last thing I want to do is add a lens distortion. And that's going to give it almost a fisheye effect and a little bit of RGB separation. I had 0.03 for the distortion. That's going to make it pop a bit. I'm going to close this timeline tab. That's going to make it pop a bit. And I'm also going to add a little bit of dispersion, 0.03 as well, to give it some artifacts around the edges like this. And it's really subtle, but I think it looks good. And finally, because you can see it's actually, because it's being distorted, some of the edges are being lost. So we can just checkmark fit, and that's going to make it fit the whole screen. And obviously you don't need the color or the lens distortion. You especially don't need the lens distortion. I just think it makes it look better for, the YouTube thumbnail. But yeah, that's literally it. This whole section right here you can dedicate to customizing it however you want. And that's the entire thing. So what I'm going to do is render this, and I'll see you in a few seconds. Alright, and this is the final product. It looks pretty cool, pretty clean. Great thing about this is you can customize it however you want. If you want to change the colors, if you want to change the gradient, if you want to change post-processing, it's all there to customize. That's going to be it for me. I will link a high-resolution image of the final composite nodes in the description. And if you found this tutorial useful, make sure to subscribe to catch more content like this in the future. Peace.